Hi, my name is Dr. Erin Keating, and this is my channel, Dr. Erinnerung, where I talk about popular culture related topics that are related to my teaching, to my research, often about fantasy, and often about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, though not exclusively. And I want to note right off the top here, there's spoilers for the full series, so that's sort of your first warning. And secondly, this video is directly inspired by Ruth and Bad's video from about a year ago now, actually. I think Homosexuality in Malazan Book of the Fallen. And if you haven't actually seen that video, I encourage you to do that. I've linked it here. And I want to say that while I'm critical of some of the things that he says in that video, there's also some things I really like about that video as well, including at the end, the reading of The Crippled Gods, so the final book in that series. I find it quite compelling what Bad does with that one. So while I'm going to be touching on perhaps some of the earlier stuff, I do think that video is great and I encourage you to watch it. This is a video I've wanted to make for quite some time, and I've sort of been dragging my feet on it a little bit just because I find it quite difficult to be critical of a series that I love. And maybe you could sort of understand this. But I also think it's really important to critique things that, for the most part, you are very much on board with, because it is helpful to be specific, right, about what things really work for you, what things perhaps don't. And that's not in any way trying to sort of say we shouldn't read something or throw out, the baby with the bathwater, if you will. It really is about being able to look at some things and say, well, at this moment, this thing, this part didn't work for me, and here's why. And so I am going to be sort of talking about that when I'm talking about the representation of homosexuality in Malazan. And so to start off, I'm not claiming there's no homosexuality in Malazan. Certainly there is. And sort of just off the top of my head here, like a number of the sort of pairings we have and some that I'll be talking about. Of course, you have Tavore and T'Amber. You have Picker and Blend. You have the errant, who is shown to be bisexual, or pansexual. Doesn't really go into labels, of course, and we'll get back to that a little bit. And Ruth and Bat talks about that as well, if that's something you're interested in. And also Yed and Derrig, and a number of other sort of smaller characters here and there and whatnot. And so it's not that homosexuality is not present. So that's not what I'm claiming. But what I am going to be talking about is my issues with the way it is depicted in this series. And that is where I'm disagreeing with the video that inspired this, with Ruth and Bad's video. And so to put it just very straightforwardly at first, the depiction of all of the homosexual characters in this text is sort of under the radar. And what I mean by that is they don't express open physical desire for each other in a way that many of the heterosexual characters do. Right? So if you think of Tattersale and her sort of open desire, if you think about Hetton, especially when we first meet her, right? And she's very busily trying to aggressively sleep with all of the people, with all of the men that she's meeting up with in the Malazan Empire. You have the banter between Marines. You have Crocus, of course, who falls in love with first Chalice and then Absalar. And so basically, you have these very, very visible descriptions of heterosexual desire and heterosexual coupling and love. And yet, when you're talking about the pairs, um, who are homosexual, it's very, very understated. So Ruth and Bad calls this, understated nature of the homosexual characters a strength of depiction, right? He's reading it as a more subtle depiction of homosexuality, what I'd call a pre-modern version of sexuality following the work of Michel Foucault, before it became coextensive with identity and when it was understood more as a behavior than as an identity. And I really wanted to follow that. But I disagree. And so to explain that, I want to focus on the relationship first of Tavore and T'Amber. And I also want to note that I'm focusing here mainly on the Malazan Empire, as of course there's many different cultures and societies depicted in the novels, but this is the one that's sort of, at the center of the text, and that acts sort of as a melting pot in other ways, a very sort of equitable gender society for the most part and whatnot. So this is what I'm thinking of when we're thinking about sexuality, is the Malazan Empire in particular. And so when I first watched the video, I tried to think about, I wanted to think about Malazan society as pre-modern, as a society in which sexuality hadn't emerged as fundamental to a person's identity. Or to quote Foucault, before it became the stamp of individuality, right? And this is a very sort of pre 18th century, even some in some ways pre 17th century version of sexuality. It's really changing during the 17th century if we're talking about sort of Anglo-American culture. And it's possible that this was the original intent, right? Because we don't have any overt identity politics related to sexuality, genre, or race in the series, right? And when we get explicit or even sometimes implicit explorations of identity, they tend to be based on occupation, right? Like the adjunct, the sappers, or on different social roles like motherhood, for instance, not on the categories of identity that have become more dominant, at least in current North American society, which is, of course, where I'm coming from, right? So, this idea that identity in this novel, I would agree, is being treated in a very pre-modern sense, is being treated in what is sort of defined as an externally oriented character, but we don't have to talk about that. That's getting into the weeds. So in a lot of ways, this is what Erickson and us want to do in terms of identity, in that they are not interested in the types of identity that have really come to dominate current discourse, right? And that's fine. I don't want them to change that. I actually sort of love that what they do in a lot of ways with race and with gender issues and whatnot in the series. However, to my mind, Erickson does not quite succeed in doing that when we're talking about sexuality. So I want to explain why, for me, this is not a pre-modern sexuality in the way that it's being described. Unlike the treatment of race in the Malazan Empire, which is very much depicted as a pre-racial society as far as, how we understand things now, in that stereotypes are more likely to be based on sort of culture or geography rather than on skin color, right? Sexuality is not treated as if it's mere variety in the same way that race seems to be in the text. And so I had to actually abandon my attempt to view this as a pre-modern style society with regard to sexuality because the society in the series is most often depicted as one of compulsory heterosexuality, to use Adrienne Rich's phrase. And this means like there's both an assumption and even a compulsion in this world to be heterosexual, to feel desire towards the opposite sex. And in particular, it's that assumption, right? That is the default that is really sort of present throughout the series in ways. And so to give you a sense of what that means, as Rich sort of defines it, quote, there's a cluster of forces within which women have been convinced that marriage and sexual orientation towards men are inevitable, even if unsatisfying or oppressive components of their lives. And of course, all things I quote are down below, linked below if you're interested in reading more about any of the theorists that informed the way I'm thinking about and reading this. I also want to put a caveat with Rich, because she's mainly writing, or she mainly wrote about this in terms of female experience and lesbianism, and I can't wholeheartedly endorse the essay because it has, to my mind, some very problematic elements that are characteristic of sort of second wave white feminism more broadly. But compulsory heterosexuality is, I think, still a very important concept and has been very influential in terms of queer theory, in the sense that she really was one of the early people pointing out that society treats heterosexuality as if it is natural, as if it is an essential part of being a woman or being a man, is having this desire for the opposite sex. While, like the relationships themselves, the assumption towards heterosexuality in Malazan is not overt. It's still very much there, right? There's numerous moments when like a character will quip, like either talking about themselves or more tellingly about another character, needing a woman in some way, right? With the assumption always being that the sexual need is a heterosexual one. And while homophobia is not present in the series per se, I'm not saying that it is, there is an assumption that homosexuality isn't part of the norm alongside heterosexuality. Like the assumption towards heterosexuality is what defines these casual quips, these jokes, and these sort of casual sexual incidents between people throughout the series. And so one of the ways we can think about an example of this is Gamut's thoughts, right? When Tavore asks him to send for T'Amber in front of the other fists. And this, I believe, is in the Bone Hunters. And so what he says is, because she has asked him to get T'Amber in front of them. And he says, quote, uncharacteristically careless. That perfumed lover of yours has been kept from the sights of everyone here but me. They know, of course. Even so, dot, dot, dot. Right? So this implication that the relationship with T'Amber is known, but it's supposed to remain hidden somehow, right? It's not supposed to be out in the open in any way. And so slightly later, there's an exchange between Gamut again and Tene Peralta, and we get this following statement from Peralta, which is incredibly indicative, frankly, of compulsory heterosexuality. He says, Fist, he said, what is the situation with this timbre, do you know? Why is the adjunct being so cagey? Women who take women for lovers, the only crime is the loss to men, and so it has always been. And I want to sort of pause there for a minute, right? In the sense that there is this need to know about the relationship. There is this implication, and this is why Peralta's asking in this scene, that perhaps T'Amber has too much influence over Tavore. So this idea of the fact that there is this lesbian relationship is seen as a potential threat politically. And this has a very long history, which we're not going to go into, but this idea of undue influence, particularly of women and female partners over someone who's in a position of power, has a very long history in Western thought, and is what I study when I'm studying secret histories of the 17th century. And so this assumption also in Peralta's phrase that women taking another woman from a lover is stealing from a man, right? So even his claim that's like his seeming implication of who cares is still even premised and framed within this logic of, but by nature, women are supposed to belong to men. And so if women pair up, they are somehow taking something from men. And that is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this notion of compulsive heterosexuality. This idea that the assumption in the society, even if it's tolerating or turning a blind eye or quietly ignoring the homosexuality, the assumption is what is natural is to feel desire for the opposite sex. If you'll remember, this is sort of like put down to privacy on Tavore's part, right? So it's made part of her character. And so this recognition of the queer sexual orientation, it's there, it's present. It is quiet though, it's kept private. And so this isn't a world where queer relationships are accepted in the same way that the gender equality is, right? In the same way that the female power or prominence is for the most part. And of course, there's some quibbles you could be had with that. So my point then is that the assumption is compulsory heterosexuality. And I would add compulsory sexuality, but I'll get to that later in the video. And so the homosexual desires are shown as basically, or I should say the homosexual relationships, that's an important actually mistake I just made, are lacking desire, right? They're shown as basically sexless, desireless, completely under the radar. And this is frankly harmful to queer readers, and it's a disservice to queer readers of the series that we get a lot of heterosexual desire on display, but no homosexual desire on display, right? So we know that Tavore loves T'Amber, but Tavore's privacy is used almost as an excuse not to have an exploration of the physical elements of that relationship, right? And that would be fine if those elements existed in other places in the series, right? Like I don't want to change Tavore. This is a character that I also really love, but all we get is sort of queer loss and pain in that relationship because, of course, T'Amber dies. And so this idea that, I guess the problem I'm trying to point out is the fact that we have this very unequal representation between heterosexuality and homosexuality, such that to claim that this is a good representation because it's quiet is problematic because the heterosexual desire is not quiet. right? And so there is an unevenness here in how things are being represented. Now, I'm not saying that queerness and society's attitudes toward homosexuality should be front and center in the series. This is an epic fantasy, right? This is why we're reading it. We're reading it for epic fantasy. It's not interested, and I don't want it to be, a series about identity in our modern sense, right? Whether we're talking about gender identity, sexual identity, or racial identity. I love this series, and I wouldn't want to change that focus in any way. However, there are a lot of queer people who exist, frankly, and many for whom their queerness is not fundamental to their identity, many for whom it is. There is room for them, and most importantly, for their desire in a series like this. There's room to recognize that in a huge army, queer desire would realistically be present, right? So why isn't it just there, present quietly or loudly, in the same way the heterosexual desire is present, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly? Why is it that our two main homosexual characters, Tavore and Derek, are quiet, are private, are stoic, are, reserved, and there's no balance within other sort of parts of the series to that representation for queer desire at all? Because there's plenty of heterosexual and heteroromantic couples on display in this world with thousands of characters, this is a heteronormative series, right? In the same way that many current societies continue to be heteronormative societies. And to my mind, this was a missed opportunity, right? To extend what Erikson and Esselmont attempted to do for gender within the Malazan Empire to queer sexuality as well, right? To make it a world where queer sexualities also existed on equal footing with heterosexuality without comment, right? And that's the important part. I don't want it to become an issue in the series. But if they just existed at the same volume as the heterosexual couples, that would have been incredibly impactful and important, particularly for queer readers, but frankly, I think for all readers, minus perhaps homophobic readers who, frankly, I don't care about. I want to end this video by returning to a term I mentioned earlier just in passing, and that's compulsory sexuality. And this is related to compulsory heterosexuality, but it takes it sort of one step further into thinking about asexuality. So Kristina Gupta defines compulsory sexuality as, quote, the assumption that all people are sexual, and also using the term to, quote, describe the social norms and practices that both marginalize various forms of non-sexuality and compel people to experience themselves as desiring subjects, to take up sexual identities and engage in sexual activity, right? So even more than compulsory heterosexuality, compulsory sexuality is very present at the base of Erikson and Esselmont's world. Some of you may have heard me mention at the end of Four Corners of the Pages Hot Takes video, and I've linked it here as well in case you haven't seen it. You should watch that whole series. They're a lot of fun. I commented at the end when we were talking about relationships about my headcanon of Quickben as an important asexual character in this series, and how when I had sort of flippantly mentioned this to Erikson this past summer, he confirmed for me the possibility of that interpretation, which made me really, in the moment, incredibly happy. But then that also made me a bit frustrated as I thought about it, right? Because as much as it's nice to have that confirmed, it's still a reading that I need to dig for and actually slightly force when I'm reading the series, given the couple of times I've noticed on the reread, when Quickben's sexuality is actually mentioned. I mean, it's not mentioned often, but there are a couple of examples that I do want to bring up here to demonstrate what I'm saying about this. The first example is in a conversation with Whiskey Jack. It's in Memories of Ice. When Quickben sees Whiskey Jack and Corlat holding hands, he comments, quote, "Hood knows I can't remember the last time that I had a woman." And certainly this might be read as he's never had one, but that's not the obvious reading of that, right? Like the obvious reading is it's just been a long time and he's either voluntarily or involuntarily celibate, which is different from asexuality, right? So we could, if I want to think about Quickben as an asexual character, I have to sort of read this as him masking in order to portray himself for this society of compulsory sexuality, right? To basically mask and perform heteronormativity to Whiskey Jask in this moment. There's a second example that I also want to do. This is in the same line that is in the Bone Hunters, and this is in response to Callum asking if he's in with like Tavore's plans, right? Because Callum's trying to get a sense of whether they should be supporting Tavore or not. And he responds with a joke about a threesome with Tavore and T'Amber. And so the quote is, with her? In what? In bed? No. T'Amber would kill me. Now, maybe if she decided to join in, it'd be a different matter. So again, we have this sort of joke that's implying heterosexual, implying heteronormative, although, slightly queer, and we're talking about a threesome. And Callum is one of Quickben's closest companions. And yet, if we're able to read him as asexual, he's masking as hetero with a close friend, right? And so it's hard to read against this, considering most readers will be coming to this from a point of view of compulsory sexuality, which is very much, what dominates our current North American society, right? And we always have to remember that, sort of where readers are coming from, so what their assumptions will be. And there is one passage from Reaper's Gale that does provide potential evidence of either Quickben's asexuality or a queer sexuality on his part. And so I want to read that and then pause for a moment to think about this. So he's trying to get out of the warren he's in. He began applying more pressure, seeking soft spots, weaknesses. I know you exist. Ah, you are now aware of me. I can feel that. Curious. You feel almost feminine. Well, the first time for everything. And I'll leave the rest sort of going through. But so there is an element here, some potential textual basis for interpreting Quickben as asexual with that first time for everything sort of idea of penetrating something that's feminine. But it's so obscure, right? That even in my offering this, I'm absolutely opening myself up to accusations of reading too much into this passage, of sort of, misinterpreting, of like how accusations that I'm using it too much to anchor my interpretation of Quickben as asexual because of how it's represented, even with Erikson saying, well, yeah, you could read it that way. He made it so hard for me to read it that way. And that's a problem for queer readers, right? That's a problem, particularly in a series that, reading as a woman, on the other hand, you really see and can be very interested and happy about the ways that they have tried to make gender inequality not really so much structurally anyway, not an issue, right, in the Malazan Empire. And so it comes as such a disappointment to have the sort of the injunction that if you want to read for queerness, if you want to see queerness as a sexual orientation specifically, you have to try so hard to read so deeply into these characters and frankly open yourself up to what would be the dominant readings of, for instance, being happy that you're not seeing homosexual desire on the page, or being happy to assume that Quickben making these jokes just conforms to his assumed heterosexuality, is not masking potentially an asexual person beneath that because, he feels he has to mask in a society characterized by compulsory sexuality. This is part of, I want to conclude here because, again, I love this series. And so I just feel like it's an incredibly missed opportunity on the part of Erikson and Esselmont for their queer characters, that they really thought about, structural gender inequality, for instance. They really thought about structural racial inequality. But when it came to writing different sexual orientations, they really haven't seemed to think about that structurally in a similar fashion. Because all that would have been required would be to have, some queer desire present, to have it not have to be worked so hard for to get to see, and to enjoy. So that's it for me. Thank you very much if you've gotten to the end of this video. If you haven't already, give the video a like, subscribe to my channel, and if you have any thoughts, just put them down in the comments below. I always love to view this as a discussion, not a lecture, and so I'm very interested to hear what you may think on this topic and on my reading.